Hi, Dolores. I hope you guys can see me and hear me. Not sure my sound is all right. I'm sure my computer is very slow. It should be okay. Okay, I had a Zoom meeting tonight that seems to screw with my computer somehow. Sound, no pick. Oh, that's all right. There's the pick. How's that? Lana says, Happy Wednesday. Happy Wednesday. So my sound's okay, right? So let me know, please, before I start. I want to know I'm talking to you, okay? Oh, Dolores says she can hear. Good. Excellent. Thank you very much. Okay. So I'm going to start. Somebody, Susan Eldridge, I think, asked me something not too long ago about the printing thing. But before I go to that, my Facebook page doesn't seem to want to come in at this point. And I wanted to make sure I was public on Facebook. Okay. Looks like everything's okay. So I'm going to share. I'm going to share something I wrote some time ago. That was on the printing money thing. Okay, the printing money thing. There it is. You should be seeing it now. It was a daily cost piece. So right now you're seeing a bunch of computers, the ad. But I'll take care of that in just a second. So I wrote this under my handle, which is Let's Get It Done, on daily costs. I haven't written anything on daily costs for some time, but at one point I was publishing a lot on there. So that dates from June 15th, 2011, which makes it, I guess, 9.5 years old now, right? So I said, if you're a progressive and want to fix problems like unemployment, the healthcare and health insurance systems, infrastructure, education, our energy and climate crises, and want government to deficit spend to do it, sooner or later you get the question, aren't you just printing money? So here's my answer to that one. No. Because, number one, today the government prints very little money. It mostly just marks up accounts. Using computer when the Treasury spends or when the Fed buys financial assets in return for reserves it creates. So literally, I'm not saying we should, quote, print money, unquote. I'm saying we should deficit spend by, quote, marking up, unquote, non-government accounts. Also, the idea of printing money being a bad thing is a hangover from the days before 1971 when money was backed by gold or other commodities. Quote, just printing money, unquote, referred to printing it without acquiring the gold or silver or other commodities needed to back it. So before 1971, there was a contrast between old money, which was commodity, largely gold backed, and merely printed money, which was not. Money that was backed was worth something. Printed but unbacked money was worth less, or even worth less, depending on conditions. 3. Now we have our fiat currency system to describe, now that we have our fiat currency system, to describe government deficit spending as, quote, printing money, unquote, is way off base because it ignores two important realities. First, these days, all U.S. government money is fiat money. It is all unbacked by any commodity. There is no distinction between old money and newly created money. And the new money created when government deficit spends is worth no more and no less than the old money. Second, and assuming that the government did create money without issuing debt, the closest thing you can get right now to the old printing money, quote unquote, to pay its bills, would the effect be bad or intolerable, or would it be good? That's the real issue raised by government spending, whether it's deficit spending or otherwise. 4. So I know your printing money question is raising the issue that government deficit spending for state revenue sharing programs, payroll tax holidays, job guarantee programs, or other government deficit spending I favor would have a bad outcome because it would cause inflation. What you're really asking me, though, is not whether I'm in favor of, quote, printing money, unquote, but whether I'm in favor of inflationary deficit spending. My answer to that real issue is no. I'm not proposing inflationary government deficit spending. I'm proposing government deficit spending targeted on job creation and other valued outcomes until we get to full employment. There's no evidence that such spending is inflationary at all. If you have any, I'd love to see it. But all I see right now is some commodity inflation, which has nothing to do with government deficit spending, because this was at the time of QE, and also a great deal of deflation in other areas of the economy that has everything to do with the fact that the government is deficit spending far too little, and also on the wrong things to enable the economy to perform up to its potential. At the time, deficit spending by the government was, I don't know, maybe 8% or 9% of GDP or something like that. And it was being spent on the wrong things. A lot of the deficit was being caused by tax cuts, in other words. So that's it. That was my answer to the printing money canard. Okay, I hope you liked it. I hope you find it convincing. It's one of the simpler answers I've ever given to an MMT-based question. As you can see, it can't be more than 800 words, right? It's a short post. So that's the first thing I wanted to talk about that I thought might be relevant for today. So next, I want to talk about something that is unrelated, but I thought it might be relevant to today because we're having a lot of trouble today. Oh, by the way, speaking of trouble, As you know, by now, Trump got impeached by the House for the second time. Mitch said on or about that time he wasn't going to reconvene the Senate till January 19th. Thanks, Mitch. That's a big help. Big help. Mitch does a big help. Right? So here we are. On my old blog. You'll notice it's the All Life is Problem Solving blog at kmci.org. KMCI stands for Knowledge Management Consortium International. That was my old organization that was basically a vehicle for me, and I was doing a lot of knowledge management stuff on there. And then in 2009 and 2010, I basically made a transition to politics. And since that time, most of what I was doing there was politics. And eventually, I stopped actually putting blogs up there, for the most part. And even when I was putting them on at this time, I was also blogging at Fire Dog Lake and Corrente Wire and Campaign for the American Future and some other places, as well. So I was cross-posting, a lot of my blogs. But my home blog was this one, at that time. This was dated July 4th, 2009. So I used to decorate the blogs with nice pictures. I think this one was from NASA somewhere. Anyway, so this is written on July 4th, 2009. Of course, I was in a July 4th type of mood. We were about 6 months, not quite 6 months, into the Obama administration. This is relevant to that. Anyway, I start off. Once a friend from New England, who, by the way, was a strict Episcopalian, who delighted in calling himself an Anglican, to emphasize what an Anglophile he was, and to emphasize the fact that a high Episcopalian and the kind of doctrine they had was very close to the Anglican Church, in England. He loved to tell me that all the time. So, he was a friend in my graduate school days. But this was at East Lansing, Michigan State. Thanks, honey. And what he told me was that the culinary thing to do on Independence Day was to eat salmon and green peas, practicing a kind of symbolic cannibalism, celebrating the American victory over the Redcoats, also known as, quote, lobsterbacks, unquote. I've forgotten why green peas were part of the ritual, and I've always wondered why it wasn't lobster and green peas rather than salmon and green peas. Granted that lobster is much more expensive than salmon these days, but in colonial times, lobster was the food of the common man in New England. Whenever they play the national anthem on Independence Day, I'm always reminded of the Battle Hymn of the Republic, which I think would have been the anthem but for the southern states and, the aftermath of Reconstruction and the gradual rapprochement, between the North and the South, which, of course, involved setting up the racist regimes, racist dictatorships, basically, in the southern states. And so we adopted the Star-Spangled Banner as the national anthem because the Battle Hymn of the Republic wouldn't have been very popular with the southern states and wouldn't be popular today with the southern states, nor would it be popular with the racists. But anyway, one of the best versions is here, and in this post, I link to that very good version of the Battle Hymn of the Republic, which has always been my favorite anthem, of course. Since I moved to Washington, D.C. in the 1970s and watched fireworks at various local sites and on the mall, in the middle of very diverse and cosmopolitan crowds, I keep thinking of the United States as the empire, at least an informal, commercial one, and as an empire receding with the passing of the 20th century and the development of a multipolar world. Though some might find this change alarming, I think it is good for the United States. It is not good for a republic to be at the heart of an empire, or for democracy at home to be dependent on authoritarianism and hierarchy abroad. And it is not, quote, American, unquote. Not in line with the, quote, the better angels of our nature, unquote, or with our belief in equality. Independence Day also makes me think about the meaning of, quote, freedom, unquote. There are many Americans who take a narrow view of freedom, covered basically by, quote, leave me alone, unquote, and, quote, don't tread on me, unquote. But as one moves through American history, freedom has become intertwined with equality, since extreme inequality means the absence of anything but formal freedom for the very unfortunate and the very poor, who I suppose are also very unfortunate. Franklin Delano Roosevelt's four freedoms included freedom from want and freedom from fear. And after the Second World War, the United States made great progress toward achieving at least freedom from want for Americans. But that progress ended with the failure of Lyndon Johnson's war on poverty and Richard Nixon's policy of, quote, benign neglect, unquote, for poor urban blacks. Since then, the United States has focused on narrower ideas of freedom, especially so-called, quote, economic freedom, unquote, too much of which, since markets are not self-regulating, always ends up meaning freedom for the increasingly few and poverty-imposed economic constraints for the increasingly many. This Independence Day, again, July 4th, 2009, when I think about freedom, I think it's time for America to turn away from the preoccupations of the past 40 years and to turn once again to freedom from want and freedom from fear. And now it's 11 years later, and of course, we have even less freedom from want and even less freedom from fear, don't we? And to seek America's promise for these freedoms, and with progress towards them, a greater measure of our other key national value, equality. But today, the United States is moving rapidly away from democracy and open society and toward plutocracy. I would change that to oligarchy now. And I wouldn't say move towards, I'd say we're there. Okay, and then I'd go on with the state limiting real freedom to a few. Then I said, we cannot allow that to happen. Well, guess what? We did. As Lincoln said, okay, on another July 4th, speaking of the dead at Gettysburg, it is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Unquote. We're still fighting that fight. And we're in a big, serious crisis about that. And we have not won that fight yet. Not by a long shot. So here we go. With the next piece, which appropriately enough is called I Ain't Marching Anymore. That title was taken from a song by Phil Oakes, well-known folk singer of the 1950s, and one I really liked. And this was on July 5th, 2009. What I said then was, in an article by C.C. Connolly, which appeared in WAPO yesterday, the Washington Post, of course, President Obama, in a pre-holiday call with a small group of 6 high-level Democrats from both houses of Congress, expressed concern over efforts by progressive advocacy groups in online campaigns and advertisements to target, quote, to target the moderate Democrats whose positions on healthcare reform have expressed opposition or lack of commitment to healthcare proposals lacking a robust public option. The president, according to 3 sources who were parties to the conversation, asserted that these groups ought to stop using their resources in attacks on the moderates, focus on, quote, winning the debate, unquote, and build support for legislation that will expand coverage, control rising costs, and modernize the healthcare system. And he also hinted, quote unquote, that he was trying to, quote, discourage them from future attacks on Democrats, unquote. Can you just imagine Joe Biden doing that very, very soon? He's done it some already, right? He's going to do it even more. Well, I can't be sure how the progressive advocacy groups will react to President Obama's displeasure and his calls for unity. I can certainly tell him what my reaction is. It is to ask, what have I gained by supporting him thus far? And what will I gain by focusing on building support for healthcare reform legislation that either doesn't yet exist or that he will likely sell out at the last minute on the altar of bipartisan compromise anyway? Sound familiar? Think that's going to happen with Joe Biden? Let's look at the record, shall we? So far, your administration, that supposedly knows so much about how to get bills passed in Congress, has successfully passed the S-chip bill. That was this healthcare for children bill, and the Lilly Ledbetter equal pay bill. 2 good pieces of progressive legislation. However, apart from that, you've passed a clearly inadequate stimulus bill, about half the size it should have been. It was $787 billion, of course. It should have been more like $1.8 trillion, which is what Christina Romer would have recommended to him if Larry Summers had allowed that recommendation to get through. With far too much in tax cuts and far too little in really effective stimulus spending, like higher unemployment spending, like higher spending on Social Security, like Infrastructure spending. The fiscal multiplier on tax cuts was only 1.3. There wasn't very much further spending there on those that would have had primary fiscal multipliers of 1.6 and 1.75 and 1.8. Anyway, which thus far has had very little effect on employment as far as anyone can tell. Remember how stubborn the unemployment rate was, how slowly it went down in those days. You've bailed out the banksters when you should have taken them into receivership, and thereby are reinflating the financial system that caused the crash of 2008 in the first place without producing any real reform. And while you allow executives at some of the big banks to draw unprecedented levels of compensation, you've done nothing to prevent these same banksters from raising interest rates unconscionably on credit cards, while pretending, along with Congress, that the recent credit card reform bill is a great gift to the consuming public. You're making progress on an energy bill that may be a beginning in climate change policy, but that is far too weak in its provisions and far too kind in the advantages it gives to the coal industry. Oh, by the way, he never passed that climate change policy, of course. Just gave up on it because his time was totally consumed by the so-called healthcare reform, which bailed out the healthcare industry and did very little for people. Left 356,000 fatalities on the table and 30 million uncovered people. But that is too far. That is far too weak in the provisions of that bill, and far too kind in the advantages it gives to the coal industry. Meanwhile, in the areas of civil liberties, constitutionalism, and human rights, you are a grave disappointment to progressives and to many true conservatives as well. You're doing everything you can to fight transparency in this area, to defend the obnoxious and anti-democratic state secrets doctrine, and to prevent investigation of and trial and punishment for those in the Bush administration who may have violated the law by torturing people. And in preventing investigation and punishment, you yourself may be crossing a line into violations of international law and U.S. treaties, which, of course, Obama did. He did this for years and years. And both Bush and he were guilty of war crimes. And, of course, we've just ignored that. And there's been no penalty for that. Just going along with the different systems of justice for different kinds of people that we have in this country. Moving to health care reform, you along with your allies in Congress have taken single-payer health insurance, quote, off the table, unquote, even though surveys show that a majority of Americans support single-payer. But by doing that, you have deprived the legislative process around healthcare reform of transparency. I published this, by the way, just before the Medicare for All slogan was becoming current. Going on, you arrogantly and disingenuously talk about progressives joining you in, quote, winning a debate. But we can't win the debate because thanks to you, we can't even debate in favor of the alternative we and the majority of Americans prefer, namely single-payer national health insurance. Instead, we're asked to defend the idea of a private insurance system with a public health care option. Sound familiar, folks? Biden's going to ask us to do that again, after it was a miserable failure in 2009 and 10. Something that we don't really believe in and only grudgingly and with resentment accept as a barely acceptable compromise, which now, by the way, folks, we no longer accept as a barely acceptable compromise. Your strategy on healthcare has left us back into a corner. We cannot advocate for debate and defend what we really want because you and Senator Borkus, Max Borkus, sleeping with his lobbyist, have decided it can't be passed and have given other committee chairs their marching orders. And in this way, we have short-circuited a real and transparent debate. Instead, we have to advocate for the second best alternative you've left us, and now you're even daring to complain about us insisting on that second best, which, by the way, 76% of Americans would find acceptable, that was in 2009, by pressuring moderate Democrats to vote for that themselves. So that in the end, we're sure to end up with something that isn't even minimally acceptable to either us or most Americans. That, by the way, was the Affordable Care Act, which got passed 9 months later. Namely, another health care bill that is a giveaway to an insurance industry, that was the Affordable Care Act, that has been at war with the American public for at least a quarter of a century now, and then when it's time to cover people, uses its legal power to deny coverage on grounds that may be legal according to the fine print in insurance contracts, but that appear to the recipients of this treatment to be plain and simple fraud, whatever the lawyers and judges have to say about it. So where does an examination of the record leave us progressives? I think it leaves us with a strong impression, if not conclusion, that marching in lockstep with you is not going to get us anything we want or even anything worthwhile. And that our best bet to change that outcome is to stand with what we think the American people want and need and what we think they elected Democrats to provide. And when we see other Democrats moving away from that, or worrying about the welfare of the banksters or the healthsters or the coalsters, when working people are experiencing hardships unprecedented since the Great Depression, what we need to do, since you evidently won't do it, is to raise money and use our resources to point out to their constituents they are straying from the promises that we think the Democratic Party and you yourself made to the American people last November. That is November 2008. If we do that, perhaps those moderate Democrats will learn that the moderate, quote unquote, doesn't mean being willing to support special interests or giving up the vital interests of working people to serve banksters, healthsters, or coalsters who have been heavy contributors to their campaigns in the past. And even if they don't learn that lesson, perhaps they'll learn the simpler lesson that if they don't vote for the interests of working people, their constituents will know that they're Democrats in name only and that they're prime candidates for defeat in the Democratic primary the next time they run for re-election. Well, we're starting to get that only 10 years later, of course. But we do have people who plain went away from the Democratic Party and voted for Donald Trump. And so we had 4 horrific years because of what they did to serve the banksters, the healthsters, and the coalsters during the Obama administration. For your information, Mr. President, but progressives aren't just carrying on online in advertising campaigns against moderates, reminding them of what it means to be a Democrat. We're also starting to whip congressmen to take pledges guaranteeing that they will vote no on healthcare reform legislation that fails at least to provide a robust public option that will force private insurers to compete and lower healthcare costs and prices. That was second best, a robust private option, public option, I should say. This restricts your free, by the way, a robust public option was supposed to be one that would serve 130 million people, not the one that came out of the Democratic committees in May of 2009 with the blessing of Nancy Pelosi that was only going to serve 10 million people. If this restricts your freedom of action in bargaining to get a bill passed this year, well, that's our intention, and it's just too bad. Your freedom of action in bargaining with moderate Democrats and Republicans has produced nothing worthwhile up to now anyhow. We progressives don't want another piece of legislation from your administration that fails to measure up and solve one of America's most serious problems. We're not interested in legislative kabuki this year. Solve the healthcare problem, damn it, or let the people who don't want to solve it go on record as opposing a real solution so they can face the voters in 2010 with that on their record. By the way, they did go on record in 2010 as opposing a real solution because they voted for the ACE and they faced the voters in 2010 with that on their record. And as we all know, they got slaughtered. That was the record of political incompetence of the Obama administration and moral bankruptcy of that administration as well. So Republicans have gone on record saying that single payer was a deal breaker for them. They've also gone on record saying that a robust public option is a deal breaker. There are a number of moderate Democrats who have expressed their doubts about a robust public option, and others have stated they are opposed to one straight out. Most recently, some Democrats in the House have told Speaker Pelosi any reform bill with provisions that cover abortion and reproductive health is a deal breaker for them. In none of these cases have you complained about the senators or representatives who have done this, or asked them to forget about their preferences or special interests, or appeal to them for unity. You haven't gone to Chuck Grassley or Dick Lugar or Olympia Snow and appealed to their patriotism to get them to support a robust public option. You haven't pressured Mary Landrieu or Joe Lieberman or Max Baucus, who confessed a few days ago that he did not even know that Bernie Sanders had introduced a single-payer bill in the Senate. That was back in 2009, folks. But now you come to us progressives and say that we should get behind the sellout of real healthcare reform that is likely to take place in the scenario that is shaping up. I say no, thank you, Mr. President, and I hope other progressives say that too. In fact, I say I've had enough, and with all due respect, Mr. President, go take a hike. Go beat up on the other guys for a while and leave us progressives to fight for the American people by supporting a bill that has a chance to work and that is not a turnover of taxpayer dollars to the health insurers. Those were days when I believed in taxpayer dollars, folks. That was me pre-MMT. Even better, join us. With your help, I know this time we will win. Stole a line from Casablanca with that last sentence. Anyway, can you see scenario like that repeating itself now? I mean, I certainly can, except we wouldn't be talking about taxpayer money, would we, this time around? But I can just see Joe Biden in a few months. Why are you beating up on all the moderate Democrats? We're going to lose in 2012, 2022, because you're beating up on them. Leave our poor moderate Democrats alone. They lost only 11 seats in 2020. Do you want them to lose another 7 or 8 seats and then we won't have control of the House at all? What do you progressives want anyway? Answer: we want real solutions to real problems. That's what we want. And here we go. This one was from April 27th of 2000, August 27th, 2009, and it was a few days after Teddy Kennedy passed away. And I'd written something a few days before that I really liked, but I felt I had missed something. So I went back and I wrote something else here, which was not as emotional as the first one, but kind of more substantive. Anyway, this one is called The Cause, the Dream, and the Democratic Party. this week, but many of us are recalling and quoting Teddy Kennedy's words. Quote, "The work goes on, the cause endures, the hope still lives, and the dream shall never die." Unquote. Of course, those words were delivered by Teddy Kennedy, and very well in his speech as well, but they were written famously by Bob Shrum. They were very inspiring. But in all the focus on these words, I think Teddy's cause is getting lost. From earlier in his speech, here are his words about the cause. The serious issue before us tonight is the cause for which the Democratic Party has stood in its finest hours. The cause that keeps our party young and makes it, in the second century of its age, the largest political party in this republic and the longest lasting political party on this planet. I don't actually think that was true, because I think the Tory party in England was much older than that, but that's another point. Our cause has been, since the days of Thomas Jefferson, the cause of the common man and the common woman. I don't think that was entirely true either, since Thomas Jefferson was a slaveholder. But, quote, "Our commitment has been, since the days of Andrew Jackson, to all those he called, quote, the humble members of society, the farmers, mechanics, and laborers," unquote. "On this foundation, we have defined our values, refined our policies, and refreshed our faith." Quote, "Now I take the unusual step of carrying the cause and the commitment of my campaign personally to our national convention. I speak out of a deep sense of urgency about the anguish and anxiety I have seen across America." Keep in mind, this was written in 1980, when Teddy was trying to grab the nomination, unsuccessfully, of course, from Jimmy Carter. So it was written in the summer of 1980. Quote, "I speak out of a deep but belief in the ideals of the Democratic Party and in the potential of that party and of a president to make a difference. I speak out of a deep trust in our capacity to proceed with boldness and a common vision that will feel and heal the suffering of our time and the divisions of our party." Because, of course, they had gone through the suffering, the stagflation, the time when the misery index, comprised of a low, was comprised of high unemployment and high inflation. Quote, "The economic plank of this platform on its face concerns only material things. But it is also a moral issue that I raise tonight. It has taken many forms over many years in this campaign and in this country that we seek to lead. The challenge in 1980 is to give our voice and our vote for these fundamental democratic principles." So Teddy was making this speech when he had already lost to Jimmy Carter. And he says, quote, "Let us pledge that we will never misuse unemployment, high interest rates, and human misery as false weapons against inflation," which was, by the way, exactly what the Federal Reserve under Paul Volcker was doing at that time, at the end of the Carter administration. They were misusing unemployment, high interest rates, and human misery as false weapons against inflation. Just as they've been until very, very recently. Quote, let us pledge that employment will be the first priority of our economic policy. Sound familiar? Read The Deficit Myth by Stephanie Kelton. Quote, let us pledge that there will be security for all those who are now at work, and let us pledge that there will be jobs for all who are out of work, and we will not compromise on the issues of jobs. They were thinking about a job guarantee even back then, with the government as the employer of last resort programs. Quote, these are not simplistic pledges. Simply put, they are the heart of our tradition, and they have been the soul of our party across the generations. It is the glory and the greatness of our tradition to speak for those who have no voice, to remember those who are forgotten, to respond to the frustrations and fulfill the aspirations of all Americans seeking a better life in a better land. We dare not forsake that tradition. We cannot let the great purposes of the Democratic Party become the bygone passages of history. In 2021, early in 2021, it seems that is exactly what the Democratic Party has done, especially during the 1990s and all the years since. I said here, I think the Democratic Party has forgotten about, quote, the cause, unquote, and about its historic mission. This mission is not reflected in the way that this administration, again, the Obama administration, is trying to fix the financial system. It is not reflected in the inadequate stimulus package of the administration. It is not reflected in the inadequate credit card reform bill this Congress passed. It is not reflected in current bills on health insurance reform that don't free regular, quote-unquote, people from the thrall of the insurance companies. It is largely not reflected in Bill Clinton's presidency, though at least those years did lower unemployment, even if they didn't produce major economic gains for working people. And it is not reflected in Jimmy Carter's presidency, which was very much focused on trying to balance the budget at the expense of employment concerns. The truth is that the cause, coupled with the dream that Teddy so eloquently talked about, seems to have been forgotten, or at least placed on the permanent back burner by the Democratic Party in favor of efforts at collaborating with the big banks, Wall Street, the coal companies, the insurance companies, and military contractors. The Democratic Party needs to recapture that cause and to make that dream live again immediately, because if it doesn't, it will be time to say of it, in the words of Cromwell, which he said to the Long Parliament in England in the middle of the 1600s. You have sat too long here for any good you have been doing. Depart, I say, and let us have done with you. In the name of God, go. In other words, if the party continues to put banks, Wall Street, health insurance companies, military contractors, and other corporate interests before its duty to its historic constituency, it will be time for a new political party, a real Democratic Party, to take the American stage, simply because without its cause and without its dream, the Democratic Party isn't needed and doesn't deserve to exist. And I might add to this, what is that new party? Perhaps and hopefully it will be the movement for a People's Party, or more simply, the People's Party, when there is a People's Party in every state in the country, rather than just in one state at the moment. So, next, I want to share another old one because people have been asking me about the nuclear option. Hope you're still here, Lana. You ask me both about the nuclear option, okay, and reconciliation. I'll tackle reconciliation, okay, another time. But this one is on the nuclear option, which is what would get used to get rid of the filibuster. Do I have the right one? Let's see. Do I have the right one, or do I need to go to another one? Yeah, I do have the right one. Okay, so here we go. This was written on October 16, 2009, and Harry Reid and other Democrats were still dicking around with the health care reform bill. Nancy Pelosi, she was Nancying around with the health care reform bill. And the title of this is Make Democrats Take Responsibility for the 60-Vote Frame. There were a number of diaries at Fire Dog Lake today, and I also cross-posted this at Fire Dog Lake. I was very active blogging at Fire Dog Lake in those months. Frame the coming phase of the legislative process in terms of the need for 60 votes to get closure and pass the public option. For example, here's a quote from one of today's diaries by David Dayen. Yes, in those days, David Dayen, now the editor of the American Prospect, was blogging 4 blogs a day, just an amazing performance at Fire Dog Lake for months on end. In those days, he was known as the D-Day. David Dayen, D-Day. There was no one who could blog as fast, okay, as D-Day, and have good news blogs. He was the one covering the news for Fire Dog Lake, okay, as opposed to opinion. And he was doing one hell of a job. He still does one hell of a job. But I don't think he has to work quite so hard now. Anyway, quote, left out of this story is the fact that any amendment to the bill on the Senate floor would in all likelihood need a cloture vote. In other words, 60 votes in order to pass. Therefore, the placement of the public option inside or outside of the merge bill is crucial, as there are probably not 60 votes to either insert it or remove it from the legislation. So allowing an amendment as a compromise, quote unquote, is not really a compromise at all. And here was another quote from a diary by NYC Eve, who was very well known at that time. It was either she or Slinkerwink who originated the slogan, or the characterization, I should say, specifically murder by spreadsheet. She used that in order to describe what the insurance companies were doing. So I believe it was New York City Eve, who originated that, or maybe Slinkerwink. I can't recall. Our names were so colorful in those days. Anyway, quote, but progressives had been told by Reid that he couldn't do anything without 60 votes. Now that he has his 60th, he's afraid to use it. It now appears that not only is it that Reed had failed in his arm twisting to get the party to vote together on cloture, it's that he's afraid to even politely ask them to behave like a party and stick together. And yet another from Montana Maven. And Montana Maven said, quote, "He needs a victory," sighed Dr. Paul Hockfield at the very end of our 40-minute interview with him on our local talk radio show. After a feisty and informative discussion with us about healthcare reform, in the end, Paul, like us, kind of sighed. When Paul talked to the Doctors for Obama group that had flown in to support Obama's healthcare reform, or whatever that was, they told him that, quote, the president needed a victory, unquote. Even though Paul is a single-payer advocate and knows, like many of us, that a national system is the only thing that will work, in the end, does it boil down to giving the president something to sign? He was politely called delusional by his colleagues. Did he not see that the Congress is incapable of passing something meaningfully comprehensive? Did he not see that there were not 60 votes in the Senate? These diaries all assume that in the next phase of the legislative process, the existence of the filibuster in Senate procedure will determine what can be done to amend Harry Reid's mark, merging the Senate Help and Finance Committee's bills. Yeah, there was a markup that was going to be done to merge the Health Committee's bills and the Finance Committee's bills. However, it only takes 50 votes plus the VP to get rid of the filibuster through using the procedure known as, quote, the nuclear option. Harry Reid can decide whether a PO will be in the bill or not. But if it's not, then Schumer, Rockefeller, or any other Democrat can do the following. One, you object to the proposed unanimous consent agreement that amendments to the bill would require 60 votes to pass. So there's an objection to the requirement for 60 votes to pass an amendment. Two, when the bill moves to the floor without such an agreement, an amendment putting in a public option will be filibustered. But also one of the senators supporting the amendment with the public option in it can make a point of order, calling for a vote on the agreement being considered by the Senate. The presiding officer of the Senate, most often the Vice President of the United States, can then make a parliamentary ruling upholding the point of order and citing the Constitution of the United States rather than previous Senate rules, which uphold the right of unlimited debate as the precedent supporting the ruling. Now, you have to understand that. The Constitution of the United States requires only a majority rule in the Senate to pass bills or to amend bills. There's no requirement for unlimited debate in the Constitution. That's a creature of the Senate rules. So, a point of order made to the Vice President of the United States, who was then Joe Biden, but will now be Kamala Harris, that person could make a parliamentary ruling upholding the point of order and supporting it by citing the Constitution. Upholding the point of order, citing the Constitution as the precedent supporting the ruling. Then a supporter of the filibuster can then appeal from the chair being the Vice President, by asking whether the chair's decision will stand as the judgment of the Senate. If one of them does make the appeal to the chair, then an opponent of the filibuster can move to table the appeal. Since motions to table are not debatable, the Senate immediately votes on the tabling and decides by simple majority vote. So are you understanding that? If one of them appeals from the chair, which is the only way to get the chair's decision overturned, okay, in that instance, then an opponent of the filibuster can move to table the appeal. And no filibuster can block that, since motions to table are not debatable. So the Senate then has to immediately vote on the tabling, and it can decide that by a simple majority vote. So if the Senate wants to get rid of the filibuster, it needs the cooperation of the vice president, which means it would need the cooperation of the president, as the vice president won't do anything the president doesn't want her to do. So Biden would have to want to get rid of the filibuster. Then Harris would have to be willing to rule in favor of the Constitution as opposed to the Senate rules. And then another senator who wanted to get rid of the filibuster would have to make the motion to table. And then the Democratic Party would have to vote to table it. And it could do that just through a simple majority vote. It has the 50 senators. The 51st vote would be the vote of the vice president herself. Number 7, anyway, is if a majority decides to table the ruling of the chair that the filibuster is unconstitutional and that a majority vote is enough to bring a bill to vote and to pass it, then the point of order, along with majority rule, is upheld by its action in upholding the chair. The Senate will have established a new precedent, namely that filibusters of legislation, of bills, are unconstitutional, and that all legislation henceforth may be passed by majority vote, following a point of order calling for a vote. So before I go on, note that in recent years, the Senate has gotten rid of the filibuster with respect to the appointment of lower court judges. It's gotten rid of the filibuster with respect to the appointment of the cabinet members. It's now gotten rid of the filibuster with respect to the confirmation of Supreme Court justices. The only thing that's left is the filibuster with respect to legislation. Having the filibuster with respect to legislation is just an excuse. It can be gotten rid of at any time with this simple procedure. This is what is known as the nuclear option. Sometimes it's known as the constitutional option. Now, none of this requires Harry Reid's cooperation or is up to him. The 52 supporters of the public option in the Senate would get a vote allowing them to overcome the filibuster and pass the public option amendment, attaching it to his bill. It does, however, require the cooperation of Joe Biden, who would be the presiding officer and therefore probably the president as well. And then I go on to finish the post. So I'm not going to read the rest of the post, but I'm just going to point out that if Joe Biden wants to get rid of the filibuster this time, he can get rid of it at any time. On the campaign trail, he said he was willing to get rid of it. It was Bernie Sanders who had some questions. Now, if the Democrats were to get rid of the filibuster, can they pass Medicare for all? Can they pass single payer? If H.R. 1384 were to get passed in the House by some miracle and then went to the Senate, and the Senate were to take up H.R. 1384, would it be blocked by a filibuster? Or would Biden take the opportunity to get rid of the filibuster? Or would he try to use the filibuster as an excuse, saying he can't pass single payer, okay, or Medicare for all, enhanced Medicare for all, but due to the filibuster? I don't know, but we have to see that. So that covers the blogs that I thought were relevant, at present. Those were some of the questions you had, and those are some of the answers that I give. Now there's one more thing that I want to share with you at this point, and that is that's a piece by Bo Rothstein called "What Saved American Democracy." He's assuming that it's saved. I don't know that it's saved yet. I think we're still in process. But his analysis is interesting. This appeared in Social Europe, actually, today. And I don't think Bo Rothstein, is a European, but he published this in Social Europe anyway. I think he's American. And he says, democracy is a fragile form of government. History has shown democracies can be undermined in several ways. It can happen quickly as in a coup, but democracies can also erode more slowly, as is now taking place in Poland and Hungary. Based on research on how democracies have collapsed, political science has highlighted what to be especially wary about. If political leaders do not unequivocally take a stand against political violence, do not respect democratic rights of their opponents, and refrain from promising to respect an election result that goes against them, then democracy is in danger. During his election campaign, and even more during his time as president, Donald Trump undoubtedly violated these three principles. His many false claims that the election was rigged, that he actually won, his support for his Republican Party colleagues' efforts to impede turnout by minorities, and his incitement to the mob that forcibly broke into Congress on January 6th were clear examples. But despite this, American democracy seems to have survived. The institutions of democracy, quote, stood their ground. Yet we need to analyze what principles and institutions in fact saved the day. Some often taken for granted rationalizations can be dismissed. First, luck on its side. It's not that this democratic election as such was decisive. Admittedly, Democratic challenger Joe Biden won. In many of the crucial states, his win was extremely narrow. Despite Trump's pathological lying and his many attacks on the basic principles of democracy, he received more than 11 million more votes than in 2016. We did not apparently hear a resounding defense of democracy from the American electorate. Democracy had luck on its side this time, but as is well known, luck is an unreliable partner. Nor did the principle of media freedom save U.S. democracy. Until very recently, Trump has had free access to social media, and several important television channels have supported him. Nor did freedom of association turn the trick. Trump has drawn significant support from many non-governmental organizations. Think of the National Rifle Association and the powerful evangelical churches. Nor can a free party system be said to have rescued democracy, because Trump's constant lies about a manipulated election have been widely supported by many prominent Republican politicians. To this very day, evidently only 10 Republicans joined the Democrats in impeaching Trump, even today, after he orchestrated an attack on the Congress. To this must be added that the Republican Party's efforts to make it difficult for minorities to vote and to manipulate the construction of electoral districts in their favor began long before the Trump era and will in all likelihood continue. Nor either did free enterprise make the difference. Trump and his party were flooded with huge amounts of money from big business. Instead, two other less well-known principles saved by U.S. democracy. One is impartiality in the implementation of public policies. The other is knowledge realism. In terms of impartiality, witness the surprisingly large number of local and state election officials. Many of them Republicans who opposed the repeated attempts from the White House to persuade, and in some cases threaten them into rejecting election results that did not hand Trump a victory. In a now famous recorded telephone conversation, Trump sought to persuade the person responsible for the counting of votes in Georgia to, quote, find, unquote, the number of votes that would make him the winner in the state. A large number of reports in the U.S. media testify to the election officials' strong will to live up to the principle of impartiality in the counting of votes, regardless of their party affiliation. Political science research more generally indicates that an impartial and professional election administration is a condition of a functioning democracy. In addition, the courts in the United States, including its Supreme Court, despite those judges to a large extent being appointed on political grounds, refused to comply with Trump's demands to reject the result because he could not prove any decisive irregularities in vote counting. The principle of knowledge realism is about the concept of truth. Simply put, it is possible to know whether something is true, rather than this always being determined by power relations or by notions dominant in the culture. Obviously, the election officials, the judges, and moreover the journalists who claim that there were no irregularities in the election, at least not to an extent that might have affected the result, were inspired by a realistic view of the possibility of gaining assured knowledge of what is true and what is not. Their determined dismissal of the Trump administration's allegations of vote rigging must have been based on the idea that what is true and what is false in a case like this can be established by reference to the evidence. Had the courts and election officials given up on the principles of impartiality and also knowledge realism so as to reject the election result for party political and or ideological reasons, or considered that there existed alternative election results, then American democracy would probably have been beyond rescue. Yet both of these principles of public impartiality and also knowledge realism are strongly questioned in general, and specifically within parts of the research community concerning impartiality. Consider the significant strand, in economics and political science, usually called public choice. This takes as a starting point that everyone who holds public office only strives to serve their economic or political self-interest. And this often evoked theory of impartiality is null and void. The same holds for the theory of identity politics, which has become widespread in large parts of the humanities. According to this view, a person with a certain identity, ethnic, religious, sexual, cultural, ideological, can never relate impartially to something or someone with another identity. As for knowledge realism, here too, large parts of the humanities, but also parts of the social sciences, have been infused by relativistic views that go under the name post, under the name post modernism. Within this approach, it is generally considered impossible reliably to determine by any methods what is true. What is deemed true being purportedly a product of established power relations or personal and ideological perceptions. Impartiality in the performance of public tasks and epistemological realism thus constitute the cornerstones of a secure, functioning democracy. It is therefore worrying that significant sections of the academic community have distanced themselves from these fundamental democratic principles. I thought that was an insightful article in terms of what has saved us for the time being, in terms of what failed us, in terms of actually protecting our democracy, and in terms of the threats that await us in the future, because the ideas of epistemological realism and the possibility, of impartiality, in implementing elections, these ideas are under attack. That may be why Trump's attacks on them were so effective in the first place. So let me now turn to your comments. And by the way, thank you all for continuing to stay. I see there is still a considerable number of you here. Thank you very much. Stanley Mulaic is here. Oh, that's unusual. Stan doesn't come too often. I personally like Stan because I remember his book on factor analysis. I have it, in my library. And I've reread it, on numerous occasions, though I don't do much factor analysis these days. But I used to be quite good at it. Anyway, Dolores Pierce says hi all, and Bonnie says hi, and Kay says hi. And Dolores says, I hear good. Terry says, sound good, Joe, and everybody's computer is slow today. The Top Cat plan. There he is with the Top Cat plan again. Kay says, sounds good. Dale says, sounds fine. Here, Steve Wolfbrand says, hello, Steve. Dale says, hi, Steve. Terry says, the Sean Yankee show. Sean sounded not as usual. Go Ava, Tulsi, U.S., go Jeremy. Hi, Steve and Dale. Steve says, hi, Dale. Steve says, hi, Kay. Terry says, You sent today at 6:12 p.m. What is the penalty for murdering one or two policemen with lethal weapons fire extinguisher on federal trespassing, in a riot? You sent today at 6:12 p.m. What is the penalty for murdering one or two policemen with lethal weapons? I'm not sure I quite understand that. Jim Jordan never wears a Congress pin, or American flag. That's interesting. Terry Cook says it's green hemp paper, Federal Reserve notes, worth what? Kay says shared. Steve Wolfbrand said just move the decimal point on a computer. Not a lot of printing involved nowadays. Dia Swift says, yes, MMT, I've learned about that. Good, Dia. And Lana Dell says, hello, folks. Glad you're here, Lana. I think you were in time to hear me discuss the nuclear option. I hope you are. And Dia says, hello, fellow follower. I'm not sure that there wasn't a misprint in that. Terry says, we're phasing out all crony enterprises like Wall Street, Big Bank, Big Oil Insurance with Richard Romine Foundation Economy Movement. We'll take $44 trillion to go total green, but we will save $117 trillion on buying our energy from the rulers. Well, I'll tell you, Terry, it has always seemed to me it was going to take a lot more than the $16 trillion that Bernie was proposing to go total green. I thought it was going to be a lot more than that. Gina Marie said, I'm still on the order of $100 trillion, but after all, it's our survival, so obviously money is no object. Gina Marie says hi. Steve says, is that gold still in Fort Knox when I was a kid? If not, who ran off with it? I think a lot of it still is in Fort Knox. I believe it's still there, but of course, I've never had a look, so I can't tell you from personal experience, but I believe it's still there. Anyway, I'm not going to read Terry's thing because it's kind of hard to read. There are a lot of... Anyway. Steve says, turtle-rific. Dia Swift says, that's sarcasm. I'm sure Mitch is complicit in Donald's insurrection. He just wants to hide now. Terry says, yeah, Mitch and Jim Jordan, known by Jim Boy Jordan, got to their jobs or positions by wearing out a set of knee pads. And then Terry pushes Dave Strider for U.S. Senate. And Dave has been trying to get to the U.S. Senate for years now. Steve says, even Abe Lincoln said it was a catchy tune. Oh, you mean the Battle Hymn of the Republic? Terry says, but what do we do with those who poison our air, water, soil, water, and food? We take them out, not out for lunch. How do we take on the unbeatable foe? We go green in every way. And Steve Wolfbrand said, oh, maybe that was Dixie. Terry says, one of the biggest empires here is the Rockefellers, the Rockefellers American Medical Association with their good buddies. They sleep with Big Pharma. I don't know about the AMA these days. I think a majority of the doctors in the AMA are now supporters of Medicare for All. I think that's been the case for 10 years. Dia says, what is the battle gym of the Republic? Yankee Doodle Dandy, I jest. And Terry says, 5G brings the same conditions as the virus. Hospitals have 5G, and ventilators can kill you. Kay says, Obama sucked. Anthony. And Steve says, so when does Coquette Hunter get prosecuted? I don't know, Steve. Dia says, Obama's bending over for the Republicans is exactly what Biden is doing already. It seems so, but I'm going to be a little optimistic here and suggest that Biden is not going to bend over quite so far. Steve Wolfbrand says, where's Carmen Muniz, my nemesis? I don't know, maybe Carmen had some problems getting hold of the phone today. Kay says, we couldn't afford ACA. That is partially why my Scott died of cancer at age 62. Oh, yeah, the ACA was a travesty. It was just a travesty. Steve says, who can afford that shit? Dia Swift said, well, I know Steve Grumbine wasn't able to afford it, right? Two of Donald's appointed climate scientists are in hot water. They did some real crooked falsifying. Good. I'm glad they're in hot water. And Kay says, exactly, Steve. Kay says single payer would have saved Scott. Well, I was pushing for single payer as hard as I could push back in 2009, 2010. And every time I've gotten a chance, I've pushed for it. But since then, I'm one of the only ones who talks about the death toll from lack of health insurance. Every once in a while, I do a post on that with statistics, with my own estimates of the fatalities due to lack of insurance. Steve Wolfman says, Casablanca, my favorite movie. Of course. And Evelina says, oh, bumper. Amber says, good evening, my lovelies. Good evening, Amber. Nice to see you again. You must be getting off early these days, or maybe your shift has changed. If so, that would be great. Kay says, hi, Evelina. Glad to see you. Steve Wolfbrand said, Teddy drove his mistress off a bridge while probably drunk and failed to save her. Let's keep it real. I am keeping it real. I am keeping it real. In the process, that little caper of his cost him the presidency of the United States. That happened in 1969. And as luck would have it, he was done. He couldn't run as late as 1976. And by 1980, okay, it was a bad time. If he could have run in 1976, he probably would have won in 1976. He might have won the primaries even in 1972, except for the Mary Jo Kopechne affair. So, he paid for it. He didn't pay as much as Mary Jo Kopechne did, but he paid for it. Unfortunately, I think that all the rest of us paid for it too, because I think that Teddy would have been a far better president. I think he might have beaten Nixon in 1972, and that he would have been a far better president, okay, than Jimmy Carter. Primarily because he was a far better politician, okay, than Jimmy Carter. Also, not only that, if he had become president either in 1972 or in 1976, we would have had Medicare for all back then. Back then, folks. Can you imagine how many lives of Americans would have been saved over the years? Just imagine. That little caper was so costly to all of us. Evelina Pont says, hey, Kay. Steve Wolfbrand said, is the Trump brand dead? I'm thinking yes. I don't know. I think the hunger for authoritarian fascists is still there. Okay, excuse me a second. I have to ask Monty to take control of that. Okay, she was watching on the other computer, and the earbuds fell out. And so we were getting that echo. So Catherine Tokarska said, doubt it. Yeah, I doubt it too. Kay says, I hope so, Steve, but I don't think so. Steve asks, were you a beatnik, Doc? Absolutely. I was absolutely a beatnik. I was too early to be a hippie. I've always been very politically aware. And during the early 1960s, I was very politically active too. Which was the difference between the beatniks, Kay, and the hippies. That was a large part of the difference, that we were very political. The beatniks were. Kay says, Harry Reid's old assistant was on the Majority Report and later on Chris Hayes' show talking about this earlier today. Harry Reid blew it, and Obama blew it. Okay, because Obama could have had Harry Reid get rid of the filibuster early in 2009. Then there would have been no need to table H.R. 676, John Conyers' Medicare for All bill. They could have taken that up. And with Obama backing it, he could have gotten the 51 votes he would have needed had he gotten rid of the filibuster. Terry says, it is a war song that fits us because we're ruled by the military-industrial complex. Steve says, so I got this hummingbird feeder, but one fat bird keeps chasing everyone else off. Kind of disturbing. Kay says, hummers squabble a lot. They were the only birds that actually stayed through hurricanes. Steve says, Harry is a big proponent of UFO disclosure. Watch the documentary, The Phenomenon. It will rock your world. Probably won't rock mine. I've been reading about UFOs since, I don't know, 1948, 1949. For as long as I was able to read really fluently. Evelina says, so passing of bills by majority rules in the Constitution, but the filibuster is just a Senate rule that can be deemed unconstitutional. Can't be deemed unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, and the reason why is that the Supreme Court isn't able to interfere in the rules that the Senate and the House set for themselves internally. And the Supreme Court has never tried to interfere in that and will not, stays away from it, doesn't want to get involved in a fight with the Congress because the Congress can retaliate in certain ways. So, Steve Wolfbrand says, they sure do. Terry says, people came to have their voices heard turned into chaos. Posted on January 11, 2021 by Terry. That'll teach you, got what you deserve. Now you can go where everybody has a jumpsuit the same color as your face. You lying bitch. You and gang bought misery with intent. You have to pay the bill. Yeah. Kate Clark Ryan says, tough little birds. Dia Swift says, the Millie finally spoke up. Steve Wolfbrand says, Trump might be right, okay, about our elections. They are very sketchy. The MSM is on board and won't let anyone talk about Hunter Biden. Well, I don't know whether Trump is right about our elections or not right about elections, but the truth is he couldn't produce any convincing evidence, in court. How do we know? Because there were lots of Republican judges who got those cases, and they always decided against him. The judges he appointed, many of those judges decided against him in case after case, in state after state. And the reason why they decided against him is because he could not produce any evidence. So he may be right. Okay? The Convo Couch people, okay, may also be right. I respect what they do and their presence on the ground, okay, and what they've seen. But to overturn elections in courts, you have to have evidence. You can't have just supposition or theories. I mean, I think the theories sound plausible. Certainly, I not only think the theories sound plausible, but I believe that the primary elections in California, okay, and other states that was so at variance with the exit polls were probably machine rigged. I think that's probably true. But because of the rulings by the Supreme Court, okay, or by the courts, okay, in general, since the Democratic Party is a private corporation, it evidently has a right to fix its elections. I've never understood, by the way, that particular ruling, because it seems to me that if a party is promising fair primary elections and the primary elections are rigged, that is fraud with respect to its product. Okay. In other words, if you consider its product to be a contest that people participate in, a contest among candidates that people participate in by voting for their candidate, okay, or some other candidate, then that contest is not a fair contest. It's a fraudulent contest. Even though the companies say it is fair, even though they claim it is fair, their claims are fraudulent. They should be suable for perpetrating frauds on the American public. I believe that's true. But of course, to show that those are fraudulent, well, right now, as the law stands, it wouldn't help even to show that they're fraudulent. And the reason why is because the courts have ruled, since they're a corporation, that they can do anything they want internally. What I'd suggest is that these party elections are not internal. They involve the public. They're often conducted in public schools using public facilities. That is not corporate territory. Steve says, I know. Thank you. Stanley Mulaic says K. Evelina says majority ruled. Well, majority ruled. Kay says Jim Jordan needs to go ASAP. I know. DSS says, I do apologize. I try to delete the mistyped comments, but they apparently show up anyway. That's okay, Dia. Don't worry about it. Kay says, not true. Many of us hippies were very politically active, Joe. Well, that was the impression us beatniks had. Okay, that hippies were not very politically active when it came to elections. Okay, to conventional politics. Kay says hippies got the 18-year-olds the right to vote. That's probably true. Jim Bird said, wasn't the ruling that they were in the wrong court, not that the suit was unjustified? No, I think the ruling was that what the party did is it went in there and claimed that it had the right to do whatever it wanted to do with its elections because it was a corporation. It claimed it had the right to run unfair elections. So I think the ruling was that the suit was unjustified because the party, which is a corporation, had the right, okay, to select its candidate, okay, in whatever way it chose, even through elections. Well, it didn't say in court, even through elections that were fraudulent. But the ruling was it could select its candidate in any way it chose. It did not limit it to fair elections. Did not limit it. And I think that ends things for tonight. I think I've reached the end point. So, thank you for coming. I'll be back again tomorrow night with more current news and also current issues. But I thought you'd be interested in some of those old blogs. I hope you are. So thank you for being here. And good night, Lana. I hope you paid close attention to the nuclear option and now know what it is and how it's triggered step by step. Good night, folks.